glad that we were able to meet virtually and to continue the professional development virtually. So just a couple of housekeeping. We are recording the webinar, and Anna will be muting everybody. I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you've got a question or a comment, please type it in the chat box and I will let Melody know. Otherwise, you can raise your hand also and we can unmute you and you could answer a question or give up or ask a question or say a comment verbally as well. So I'd like to welcome sorry here. Okay, Melody from Wagner CPAs. Really appreciative that you were able to change gears and offer this virtually, Melody. So thank you so much. And I'm gonna put myself on mute and let Melody take it away. But like I said, I'll be monitoring the chat box. So please type any questions or comments as they come up. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be with all of you. It would have been great to be in person because I love that interaction in person, but we know that this is also a great alternative and it gives us the ability to continue our missions while we are safer at home. So I'm going to talk today, and there's so much on this topic on board recruitment, retention, and engagement that I can only really scratch the surface, but I've tried to pick out some of the things that are probably most applicable and the best practices. And I always welcome questions and interaction. So yes, definitely use the chat box, and I wish we could have more verbal dialogue back and forth. The agenda is basically to explore some strategies for recruitment, looking at ways to foster board responsibility and retention, and then talking about engagement. So the first thing in my mind is you got to start with first things first. So you need to know what you want in your board and what your bylaws require. So it's important to make sure that you are always following the bylaws because that's the rule book, if you will, for the board. What's the size required? Optimally, a bylaw will have a minimum and a maximum, but not specify a number so that you have some flexibility. It'll have more of a range. It will identify officers, how often you have to meet, and what you have for options of meeting. One of the things we're learning during this time is if you don't have something in your bylaws or your bylaws are not written in such a way to permit remote meetings like this or telephonic voting, that's something you definitely want to consider for the future because some boards have been limited in the actions they can take or they've had to initiate kind of crisis situations to be able to initiate things during this time. There's also obviously some key responsibilities that are required by basic governance and regulatory expectations and an accountability piece. But what I have found through my work and consulting is that the most effective boards have ways to meet those responsibilities that are regulatory and more kind of, to some, boring, I guess, and still be able to then spend more time on creativity and the things that ignite the passion and why people are on the board to begin with. So that's what we're going to focus on. When starting with recruitment, the first thing I think is, again, to identify who it is that you want or what kind of board you have. Is your board a working board in terms of do they actually do, fundraisers or oversee daily operations or participate in volunteering in more events, or is it more of an advisory board? And both types of boards are important and have their place, but that's the first starting point, is to identify what it is that you want your board to be and what type of board. Then you want to look at the mission. The most effective boards obviously have a passion for what you're doing. And when I speak to boards directly, I tell them their number one job is to be able to articulate what the organization is doing, similar to a 30-second elevator pitch. If they can't speak authentically and with passion to the mission, then it's probably not the best fit. And I realize that oftentimes it's hard to recruit board members. So we take the good versus the best just to fill a seat or to meet a minimum requirement. But that doesn't change the fact that we should be striving for the best. We want the right fit in the person who fits our organization. And I'll give you a quick example from my own life. I'm sitting on a board right now that I'm on because I believe in the people who are running it and because they desperately need somebody with financial accounting background, because that's not their forte and they don't have that advice anywhere else. But I don't understand. It's in a health-related field and it's not my technical expertise, so it's hard for me to articulate that. Am I a good? Maybe, maybe not. It'd be ideal if they could find somebody with my skill set in terms of finance, but also understanding their mission better than I do. So sometimes you have to compromise, but that should be obviously a key criteria. The second thing is to have a job description. With a job description, it does a couple of things. It conveys the importance of the role, just like you were being hired for a position. So it conveys to the board member why they're important, and it also clearly communicates the expectations. The third kind of offshoot of that, and not the primary thing for a job description, is that it helps in recruitment then. If I've already intentionally taken the time to create a job description and what things are most important to that board position, it makes it easier to recruit because I'm very clear on what I'm looking for. The other aspect that helps with recruitment is to have a strong onboarding process. There's nothing worse than some of you have experienced this, to be asked to be on a board or to be asked to volunteer for something, and you show up and you have no idea what's going on and no idea what to do, and you just feel like, okay, why did I show up? You want to make it clear that what they're there for and what their value is. A couple of things that can help with onboarding is, one, to have another board member kind of be a mentor for those first few meetings or time frame so that they can answer those questions and build that relationship and help the new board member feel welcome. Another thing to consider is sharing the information that they need as a board member. I've seen different ways of doing this through a password protected portion of a website, a thumb drive, actual physical copy. You can do it different ways, but you need to get that new member the applicable information. That should include, at a minimum, the bylaws and a brief history and whatever else you think will help them really understand the mission and the passion that you have for what you're doing, how they can best contribute to that. But they should at a minimum have those bylaws and basic information so that they understand what the regulatory piece is as well. The other thing to consider when you're recruiting is obviously the expertise. Ideally, a board would have somebody who is versed in filling that financial fiduciary kind of responsibility, whether it be an accountant or an attorney or someone in banking, someone that understands that piece. Because one of the things that I see with boards is if they don't have a trusted advisor who can take the time to dig into financial matters and meet the regulatory pieces around that, the board spends too much time on doing something they don't understand, and they also don't necessarily feel comfortable with, and therefore they don't feel as valued. So if you can have that expertise and create either an executive committee or a finance committee where more of the dig deep kind of issues and regulatory pieces can be handled and reported back at a higher level to the board, the better. Needs to be aware of the financial condition, but they generally don't want to dive into the details. And that's the optimal kind of balance there. The big thing is, where do you look? Excuse me, for candidates. Honestly, the best pool starting with is the people who are getting services from or supporting your organization, because they already know you and they already know your mission. I personally believe very strongly in having a diverse board that is not just high-level experts or expertise, but really represents the community and the population that you're serving. I think it's great when you can actually have a recipient of your services serve on the board, because that's an important voice that really helps guide your mission and understand. Because we all know that sometimes it's easy to get separated or see things from one perspective where the other perspective has a completely different viewpoint. And the melding of those perspectives give a much better holistic picture, and therefore serves the community and the recipients in a much healthier and holistic way to meet their needs. So I would look at those sources first. Also, board members are another potential source. When you hopefully you've created some enthusiasm and commitment as a board, and therefore the board wants to recruit the next board member or is telling their friends about it. It's really fascinating to me sometimes when I hear the stories of somebody saying, yeah, I was at this dinner party, or I was at this work event, and we were just talking about things we do and places that we volunteer. And I started talking about the organization that I sit on the board. Next thing I knew, they were really interested and they started my donation, and ultimately they ended up on the board as well. So the power of just talking about it and spreading the word is vital. And the people who are donating, sitting on the board and getting services know the most to be spreading that word. A couple other potentials are obviously leveraging websites or other things like that where you can post the information or the need. And some communities and or schools or foundations, civic groups have different kind of recruiting events. So I would tune into what locally you might have in terms of leadership for recruiting events. I know here in Madison recently, Edgewood College hosted an event that brought together nonprofits as well as people who wanted to volunteer and gave them a chance to interact and potentially source people to serve in their organization. So those are all important pieces. When you have a smaller pool, obviously it's harder. Maybe part of your recruitment is that piece that we're going to talk about last in terms of retaining when you have a good person. The one thing I would say with recruitment versus retaining is to have a balance. It's great when you can have somebody join your organization for a while, but it also gets stale if they're too long. So I have a board that I work with where they have had the same board president through consecutive terms or re-elections, now serving 12 years. And it's gotten stale and it's hard to generate new ideas. So just keep that in mind in terms of balance. Even rotation of positions sometimes on the board may help that if you have limited candidates or limited sources to pull from. Engagement. This to me is the big piece. If you do engagement well, recruitment and retention kind of take care of themselves. Because if I'm on a board where I get to utilize my talents, feel that I can actually contribute in a meaningful way, and I enjoy the people that I'm on the board with, I'm engaged and active, and I'm more likely to continue to participate or tell my friends positive things about it. So to me, this is the key element in what you're doing. And what does it mean to engage? One of the things, and I'll talk about the different tools that I've listed here in a second, But one of the ways that I like to, when I'm consulting or sitting in on a board and measuring their engagement, I like to do is measure who talks and how much. Is the majority of the meeting either the executive director or a board president talking and nobody else speaks? Is it more information, what I call pushing out and reporting, than collaborative speaking and working together? That's a really good starting point to look at. Again, I sit on several boards and I have over the years sat on a number of them. But if I contrast the two boards I'm sitting on right now, one, I hardly ever say a word. It's very rare that I say anything. The other one, we're constantly talking and discussing and collaborating on new ideas. Guess which one I enjoy more? So hopefully you get the point out of that. Now, how do you meet your regulations and requirements of what you have to do as a board and still stay engaged? And how do you foster that engagement? That's what the things here are we're going to discuss will lead you towards. First and foremost is the consent agenda. And some of you may already be using this or familiar with it, but I'll briefly introduce it if you're not. Consent agenda basically allows for the board members to receive things like prior minutes, financial reports, maybe an executive summary of activity, maybe even a donor update in advance of the meeting. Then there is a requirement that the board is looking at those things prior to the meeting so that at the start of the meeting, you can ask if all of those things are approved as one consent agenda approval. So you save time with multiple voting on different pieces like approval of minutes, approval of finances, etc. And you have required some pre-work and expectations out of your board members. Now, I know a lot of people push back on that. Well, our board members are serving, and I don't want to give them, homework, if you will. But remember, you're going to feel engaged as if you're actually utilizing their capabilities. And by giving it to them in advance, what it also does is it allows those who take time to process some of the information, that margin, to get it embedded into their own way of thinking and analyzing. And they come prepared, maybe better able to speak to something that they wouldn't be able to speak to if they were presented with that information at the time of the meeting. So even though it seems like homework, there's a lot of advantages to using that particular tool. And I do encourage, I know people say, but you're a CPA and an auditor. Why would you let finances be part of that? Because again, if you have a treasurer or other person who's taking the deeper dive, the board doesn't need to look at the financials and minutia of it. They just need a high-level picture. It's pretty easy to teach the board the big picture of what they need to look at, and then they feel like they're still a piece of it without, or they're part of it without feeling like they have to dive deep into something that they're not as knowledgeable on. The next thing to consider is who's leading the meeting. Now, I know that different organizations and different sizes, this may vary. In a perfect scenario for broad responsibility, you would have the board president generally leading the meeting, but also potentially asking others on the board to step in as the leader for that meeting so that the topics can vary, the styles can vary. You can hear from different voices. The least effective method in my mind is when the executive director has to lead the meeting. And I understand that logistically there are times that that has to happen, and I'm not being critical of that. But the sad part of when an ED has to lead the meeting is that now the board says, oh, we're just helping the ED, or we just have to hear what the ED has to say. Not, I'm an active member and I'm responsible and I have to engage, and actually I have a job to do versus just hearing the ED out or being their support. So that's how I see that particular one. Now, when you spend the meeting, the other thing I look at, in addition to who's talking, is what are the topics being discussed? Is it mostly reports, or is there collaborative time and innovation time? So let's say, for instance, that you have seen significant drop in donors. You could spend the time just reporting on that and giving statistics, or the board time could be better spent on having the statistics and the information beforehand and part of the consent agenda, and then spending the meeting time talking about ideas to change that, different ways to message, having creativity. I loved one of the fundraising examples I heard yesterday from my daughter, who actually also works for a number of nonprofits. She said there was an organization that was taking donations to bomb in or jump into Zoom meetings with things like a llama or a message or something silly to liven up the meeting. And I thought, wow, what a creative way to engage different people and bring some humor and levity in a time when we're all kind of looking at what's next. So be innovative, and that's what your board is really good at. You've recruited the right people. And here especially, if you want to look at service opportunities and ways to enhance what you're offering, this is where it really helps to have that board member who's a service recipient. Now, you've got to make sure that your board is welcoming, because sometimes there is a very different personality between, you know, maybe you're a professional on the board and a service recipient, or life experience difference. And you want to make them all feel comfortable and welcome. So again, make sure that that's part of it. To elaborate and be able to feel comfortable doing that collaboration and innovation, you got to feel trust, and you've got to feel safe and comfortable. So this is a tough one, because it's not something that we're taught in business school or taught, even if you have the degree in nonprofit leadership, necessarily that personal relationship piece. On a very simple terms, I mean, this could again be elaborated in much more detail, but on simple terms, one of the ways to foster that trust and collaboration is just by personal engagement. So take time at the beginning of the meeting or before the meeting to check in and say, hey, how's life going? What's going on? Or celebrating milestones. The other thing is, there's nothing better than food to generate some of that time to just talk and be personal and understand who each other is. If you rarely get to meet in person, maybe it's a secure portal site or something that you share with just the group that talks about, you know, somebody's key interests or something interesting that happened this week. The more you know about the person, or the more you have a personal connection, not just this, okay, we serve on the board together connection, the better that trust and collaboration is. On a far extreme level, you have a board who can actually maybe do a day retreat together. So one of the boards, the one that I'm really enjoying is doing, is once a year we have a day-long retreat, and we spend about 6 hours doing board kind of things. But the last 2 hours, we invite families or friends, and we get together and we just have a meal or a barbecue or whatever we planned for that year. And it gives us time to create those relationships and foster the trust. In those times of collaborating and creating innovation, it's important to call on the expertise of who's sitting on your board. I have at times in my more professional role gone out to do board presentations, and I hear somebody that has a question for me being squelched because they're not the treasurer, or because they're not the person who usually deals with it. Well, one, I want to encourage all questions, but I also want to leverage the expertise of those who know what they're talking about. I sat in on a board that was talking about new creative social media ideas. And it was very interesting to me that the majority of time that they spent on that particular topic was the president speaking, the executive director, and one other board member who is more modern in terms of baby boomer. There were at least 2 other people on that board that were the millennial or X generation that is more comfortable and spends their time on social media. Never once were they asked for their opinion or what do you think, or given an opportunity to speak. So the more that you can hear from those different voices, again, adds to the depth of the conversation, the impact that actually results from decisions, and the more the board is going to feel engaged. And not everyone has the same comfort level with voicing their opinion. So sometimes it requires a good meeting leader. Another reason to periodically maybe rotate this, because some have the better gifts here than others, of drawing out who are not as conversational or wanting to pitch in without being asked specifically. So understanding that on your board and really tapping into that expertise that's sitting in the room. Then it's important for them to understand the difference they're making by being able to measure the impact. And one of the ways I like to measure the impact is relationship to the last bullet point there is with generative leadership. I don't have time, obviously, to go into this today, but there's, under this philosophy, there's 3 levels of leadership. And the first is basically that regulatory piece that we talked about. The second one is going a little further, but ultimately you're trying for the 3rd level, which is much more creative and out of the box kind of thinking. And I'm going to give you a quick example from the book about this. Boston Museum of Fine Arts had 21 masterpieces that the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas wanted to put in their lobby. The first level kind of questions from the board would have been, are the paintings secure? Is this a risky environment? Is it going to cost us? You know, kind of logistic questions. The type 2 questions would have been more about the impact and what's going to be the impact to the museum if these are seen in an outside setting. Will this damage or enhance the reputation of the museum? What can the museum potentially do with the income from the Bellagio for renting these pieces? Better questions than just the logistics and regulatory. But here's the type 3 questions for that scenario. What would we do if the price is right? How can we get art to the masses and really get the masses involved? Is it appropriate to loan art to the highest bidder? Those are all great questions that guide towards the future and not just that circumstance. So that's what you're striving for. Now, retention. As I already mentioned, to me, retention comes pretty naturally if you're doing the other elements right, of getting the right people in the right seats and you're engaging them. But other things that can help with retention, being really clear and communicative. There's nothing worse than not knowing something and having an expectation that I can address it as a board member when I haven't even been given the full picture or the information around it. So there's so many resources to share ideas and clarity and communicate out pieces, either through the consent agenda or as another factor, etc. But that is such an important piece. It's also an important piece of that relational building is to have some communication periodically. If you only meet maybe twice a year or even once a quarter, is there some periodic communication in between that keeps everybody connected and thinking about it? The inclusive participation piece, I already alluded to a little bit. You want to make sure that all the voices are heard and all the perspectives. It's real easy when you're in a setting like a board meeting to go along with the loudest voice or the most prominent opinion, but that doesn't produce the best results because you need that diversity of thinking. And it may not ultimately steer the decision in a different direction, but it's enhanced our learning and it's enhanced how we see things to have the broader perspective. So make sure that you have developed ways to have more inclusive participation. Make those meetings valuable. And that's what that engagement piece is about. If I don't feel my time is valuable and I dread going to the meeting, guess what? I'm not going to stay on the board. So it's important to leverage their expertise and make it a value time to them so that they can feel as though they're a valuable partner and contributing to the mission. Team building goes to the relational piece. This has to be, adjusted to the norms and the time and the resources that a given board has. Some boards just do not have the capacity to do and have the time to do some team building that other boards might. And that's okay. Fit it to fit your circumstances. At a minimum, if you can't do retreats or you're not together that often, maybe you can have, those periodic communications offline or off time of a meeting, or you could at least share beverages or a snack at one of the meetings or something like that, something that engages and lets you know about each other. Now, the last two are a little harder, and you've got to move your culture towards this. This is not generally something you can just drop in and implement. But it's important for the board, if they have a job description, to also have, if you will, job performance assessments, just like we would with employees. There's different tools to do that and different ways to do that. Ideally, it's within the board unit itself that they're doing these assessments, either as a whole or individually or whatever works best for your organization. But we need to take the intentional time to step back and say, what's going well? What's not going so well? Was this a good fit with this person or not, kind of thing? Or how could we better leverage the capabilities here? So those are all things to consider in the assessment piece. And then I'm a huge advocate. This one does not take that much time or effort to do an exit interview. I advocate for this both for board members and employees, because if we don't, we're missing a huge learning opportunity. And from the board perspective, we're also missing the opportunity to maintain and foster an ongoing relationship. So if you get to your last meeting and the board member says, okay, here's my last meeting, we'll say, yeah, thanks for your service, bye. That's it. Do I feel as appreciated? Do I want to continue engaging with the organization? Maybe, maybe not. But what if the president or another board member or the ED said, hey, could we take a half an hour sometime to have coffee and just chat about how things went? And then to have a few specific questions so that you can learn from what their experience was on things that you can do to continue to improve your board's engagement and culture and the desire to be there, because you want people who are clamoring to get on your board. That's the idea. My favorite story was one organization that has created so much fun and culture building and community on being volunteers or on board with the organization that they actually have waiting lists for the board and for volunteers. Now, obviously not everyone has the same gifts, and this is not intended to put a guilt trip on anybody, but just to remind people that sometimes we take all of this so structured and so more professional business-like without engaging the human side of it and the interaction and just the relationship piece of it. So I can't overemphasize that. So how do we measure how we're doing over the long term? Well, first, if I did that assessment, do I have the right people in the right roles? This is not going to happen overnight, especially if you don't have a very large pool to recruit from. But that's your goal. It doesn't help to just have a body. You want the right body. And this is the other reason I like bylaws that have a range for number of board members versus a set amount. Because there may be seasons where you can't get the right person for the right job. And honestly, it may be better than to leave that position open if it's acceptable under the bylaws than to fill it with somebody who's not the right fit. We all know that adage that one bad apple can sour the bunch. And it's so true that if you have somebody in the group who's not contributing or tends to be negative or changes the meeting tone, that has a significant impact, just like the reverse does if you have enthusiasm and positive people. So you want to make sure that you've got that right dynamic. Another way to measure that engagement is, what's your attendance like? You should be committed, if you're a board member, to attend, just like it's a job. That's, again, the job description role. One of my favorite quotes comes from Michael Gates' mother, who sits on a number of boards. And she says, I see it as my job, and I'm there for every meeting. And that's the way the board members should feel, because it's important that they're there. But not just physically there, are they engaged there? So back to that, are they participating? Are they having an opportunity to voice? I remember on one of the boards I sit on, we were talking about something that is not in my wheelhouse at all. And it was more service oriented to something technical in that particular mission. And I was kind of silent. And at one point, one of the board members looked over at me and said, Melanie, what do you think? And I said, well, this is not really my expertise, so I hesitate to jump in. Guess what the response was? This was a healthy board. No, we need your perspective, even if it's not yours, because we want to know what people who are not immersed in this understand and think about in terms of this. So that's the healthy kind of participation level. And being able to debate in a respectful and meaningful way, but have differences of opinion. And some people are uncomfortable with that, so they shy away from it. But a healthy debate where I can express my opinion and still respect having a difference, or maybe not having the same viewpoint, is another way that you can see whether you're getting towards the position that you want to be in. The ultimate decisions, are the decisions things that are just done because you have to get them done? Or do they represent something that really collaborates between the whole group and has taken into consideration that diversity of opinions and ideas? Because most of the time, you're going to see much better decisions and things are going to run more smoothly when it's not a decision that's just made off the cuff versus one that's well thought through and has that broad perspective behind it. And then, as I've said, focusing on the relationship and the common vision. There's times that boards have very little in common in terms of life experience, life stage, economics, education, whatever. It may be very diverse in those kind of things. So if you struggle to find a commonality, go back to the mission. If they're passionate about what you do, there's your common starting point. And there's a common thing you can work on. And one of the team building things that I've encouraged and I've seen done successfully is to say, okay, if I had to go out and tell 10 new people about our organization, beyond just stating our mission statement, what things would I share? Or what stories would I have? Now you're starting to see the stories and the meaning of your organization to those different people who are engaged in your board. And that then fosters broader participation and, again, that engagement. All right, I intentionally left a few minutes here if it works that we could have some open questions, or if there was anything in the chat. I'd love to share other things. My contact information is here. If you have questions, certainly reach out. And I'm going to share these slides so that they can be sent or provided after the fact if there's anything here that you want to go back and look at. Questions?
So you can, folks, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can also type into the chat box. All right. Thank you so much, Melody. How much time, so I think I really liked your idea of, of team building and of kind of connecting on a personal level. How much time do you think is appropriate to spend on that in a meeting? Like, how much time would you shoot for?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm hesitating only because
I know that's a tough question.
well, and we joke, one of the common answers that accountants absolutely love is it depends. And I hate saying that, but it kind of does.
Yeah.
Because how often do you meet and what's the comfort level of doing that? You don't want to spring something either that fosters, unease within the group. So my recommendation is, get a little bit feel for who the board is and then start slow if there's not that comfort level to start with. And maybe it's only 5 minutes at the top that one of the things that groups do that may sound corny, but it works, is high and low from the week, or share why this organization means the most, why you're sitting on this board, or what if we had unlimited dollars, what could we do? So you can take it away from the personal if you're not quite there yet as a board, but still get everybody's opinion and give a chance for everybody to kind of share on some big idea.
Mm-hmm. I'm on a steering committee, and it's a lot of fun actually. We get a lot done, but we always start. The director has just like a little candy or a little snack for upcoming holiday, whatever holiday is coming up, or something. I don't know, just something kind of something little and fun, and then asks just sometimes it's a question, to see how everybody's doing. And sometimes it's kind of just a what would you like, or would you rather, kind of one of those questions. We don't spend too much time on it, but it's actually quite fun, and I do look forward to the meetings.
And I didn't really, I'm sorry, I apologize, answer your question as to time. I would say somewhere, again, and you could alter this depending on the meeting and what else you have on the agenda, but somewhere maybe between 10 and 15% of the meeting time could be spent on this.
Excellent. So we do have a couple questions. One of our questions is, how would you address a board that has become stale in some ways? So members with long terms and board needs rejuvenating.
That's a really great question. Two things come to mind off the top. Sometimes, as hard as it is because we don't want to go out and recruit new members, sometimes it's time to say we need term limits and we need fresh blood, and in an appropriate way kind of cycle off some of the stale thinking. If that's not possible and that's not the issue, then taking those people and throwing it back to the group and saying, we've become a little bit entrenched, and how can we brainstorm on new things? And with the internet these days, there are so many ideas, and I've got some. If you want specific activities, to create a brainstorming session, take the group and brainstorm on a new problem or a new solution, and that way getting some of those creative and innovative juices going again.
Excellent. What would you recommend as the optimal board size?
Oh boy, that depends. Again, I hate that answer, but it does. Depends on the size of your organization and what you're trying to accomplish with the board. In general terms, I do not like a board that is more than a maximum of 12. And Wisconsin law requires at least 3. So somewhere between 3 and 12 is my general range. Optimally, I love the 6 to 8 range for general meetings.
Excellent. Do you have a best and worst board experience that you could share?
Oh, yeah. Worst is easy because it's amazing how those stick in your mind.
Yes.
Coming to the meeting, no one talks beforehand. Very dictatorial kind of leadership that doesn't allow much talking, only wants to vote on what they presented and get approval so that it's official. But really, there's no contribution. It's just blessing what the dictatorial leader kind of wanted. Best case scenario was the one I was alluding to before. I can't tell you how much I felt included when they asked me from my perspective on something that was my area of expertise, but wanted that outside viewpoint.
Anna says, glad to make you laugh. Good question. Yes, those. And then, oh, there's one question is, will I be sending the PowerPoint? Yes, I will be. So we'll have the recording and the PowerPoint. It'll be in the resources section of the webinar, but I can also send it out to everyone who participated today.
Well, thank
Excellent.
you. I
Oh,
really
there's
appreciate
one
it.
more, sorry, one more question, Melody.
Yeah.
Do you recommend advisory committees chaired by board members?
I'm hesitant to have too many committees, and you need to go back again to your bylaws to make sure what your bylaws state you have to have. The one committee I think you always have to have is something that's executive or finance related to make some of those decisions and do the deep dive work that you like to have done and needs to be done, but not mire the whole board with. Beyond that, I like more having adjunct groups, however you call them, not calling them committees, but something else, where it can have a board member or it may not, but it doesn't have authorization to do anything back other than come back to the board with their recommendations. Because if you create too many committees, you've now just mired yourself in a bunch of logistics and administrative work that in my mind is generally not value added.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much, Melody. This was
You bet.
very helpful. Thank you very much. And for the folks that are on, we are moving right along with our virtual regional meeting, and we are talking about digital literacy at 10 o'clock. So go grab a cup of coffee and come on back in. All right. Thank you, everybody.